Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Meat Education Project. In this episode, I interviewed Scott McKinley, who's the CEO of the SAE Institute, which started as the world's first combined practical and theoretical curriculum in audio engineering, and has since expanded into other curriculum and a global network of schools that's focused in the arts and sciences, in the creative media industry. Today they have 7 U.S. campuses, and they also have global campuses. And Scott is the president of SAE, and they're really focused on providing this relevant theory and application in the creative media industry, and making sure that's relevant to employers, to these kids getting jobs. So I was really impressed with Scott in this interview, and we have a great conversation about the future of education. So definitely take a listen. Thanks again to the Highlander Institute for supporting our program. As usual, the Highlander Institute is a dedicated community of educators and professionals working to improve the educational experience of all learners. Definitely visit HighlanderInstitute.org for more information about how they can help your institution thrive and your students thrive in this rapidly changing, rapidly evolving world. So thanks again to the Highlander Institute, and definitely take a listen to this episode with Scott McKinley from the SAE Institute. Welcome to the Meat Education Project. I'm your host, Nick DiNardo, and I'm thrilled to have my guest today, Scott McKinley. Scott is the CEO of the SAE Institute. Scott, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Nick. Great to be on your show.
Pleasure to have you. So we always like to start off by talking about our guest journey. How you grew up, what your experience has been, and what kind of gets you motivated in the future of education and learning. So why don't you take it away?
Sure, Nick. Thanks. So first of all, I'm a Pennsylvanian American by born and bred in a small town in western Pennsylvania. I think from a very young age, I had sort of an international itch that I wanted to scratch for some reason. Who knows why? But I just had this desire to work internationally, and so I spent the better part of the first 15 to 20 years of my career working and living overseas. And I guess I would suggest what came up out of that was just a very broad perspective. I was able to live and work in the UK, in London. I lived and worked in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Japan. Frankly, traveled extensively and worked around the world. Most of that professional work involved strategy consulting and also private equity or venture capital activities in capital markets, working with growth companies in China and just around the world. And what's interesting, however, if I go back to my Pennsylvania roots, is that my parents and grandparents were all public school educators. So, that was the dinner table conversation. Right. What was happening with teachers and the teacher unions and strikes in those days, and just an awful lot of interesting topics around school teachers and teacher development and faculty development. So that's what I grew up with. I grew up with those discussions going on pretty much year-round, every single day. And I was a product of a really good public education system in Pennsylvania. And so I that's kind of in my DNA. So about over 12 years ago, I was looking to make a change professionally, and right after the dot-com collapse, joined up with 2 other partners, and we began to explore some interesting education concepts. And as they say, the rest is history. After that, I became a co-founder of a private university here in the United States that focuses on bridging the skills gap between the major corporate employers of software engineering talent, such as IBM, and an education system that historically had very much focused on more the traditional approach to computing sciences. And that was I just had a fantastic experience in getting involved in education and learning much more about the regulatory and Title IV, federal financial aid, and all the operational aspects of education. And that launched me into what has been a really rewarding phase of my career, and I certainly intend to remain involved in higher education for the rest of my professional career.
That's great. That's a nice segue. And actually, my just a funny piece from me. My family actually hails from Western Pennsylvania as well, from Ellsworth, Pennsylvania, a little bit south of Washington, PA. So
that's great. I was from a turnpike town called Bedford, Pennsylvania, right between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. Yeah, so not too far, Nick, from where you grew up.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about now how you've kind of transitioned into the SAE Institute. How is your experience at SAE? What attracted you to the approach of SAE, and how does it kind of fulfill that your interest in closing that skills gap?
Yeah, so I think I need to go back again on the Newmont story for just a second.
Sure.
So the university that I helped to co-found here in the U.S. is called Newmont, spelled Neumont University. What we essentially did, Nick, is we went to IBM as a major corporate sponsor and thought leader for that experience, and we asked them what skills. We basically mapped 200 competencies that they felt and we felt that software developers just were not achieving coming out of the traditional bachelor's degree program. And we mapped those competencies. When you do something like that, what you discover quickly is that a lot of the competencies don't actually have to do with C# or programming languages and so on. A lot of them have to do with soft skills. And it's really difficult, of course, in a classroom environment or a multiple choice testing environment, assessment environment, to map those competencies, soft skills such as communication capabilities, teamwork, collaboration. Those are easy things to say and very difficult to develop in 18, 19, and 20-year-old students. But we were able to successfully do that, and we closed that gap. I was one of the proudest moments of my career professionally is when Newmont held its first commencement exercise, and we had Nick DiNardo, your namesake. But Nick DiNardo was the chief technology evangelist for IBM globally and reported at that time to Sam Palmisano, chairman and CEO. And Nick flew in on the IBM corporate jet into Newmont and presided over as the keynote speaker at our graduation exercises. And he basically said to our first 50 or so graduates, he said, you guys are unique in the world of computer science education. He said, you're the first class that I'm aware of ever been purposely designed and prepared to meet industry needs. And he congratulated the graduates, and what was kind of the culmination of that story, in addition to having some really strong support from industry, because many other corporate employers were also gathering around to hire our first graduates, is we achieved very close to 100% placement rate of Newmont graduates. And that's not easily done. I mean, there have been a few colleges that I've known over the years that have gotten up in the 85 to 90% range, but we were consistently close to 100%. And the average entry salaries were between $60,000 and $70,000, US dollars for base salary. And I just thought that was a great experience, and I learned a lot from it, and we were deeply appreciative at the time of the sponsors. So I guess, my first foray into higher education clearly was addressing that bridge or that skills gap that exists there. So when you think about SAE, it has a 40-year legacy, an even longer legacy than Newmont, a 40-year legacy of producing recording engineers and audio engineers that meet industry needs. They're specifically being prepared and trained and educated to be able to hit the ground running when they graduate. SAE then subsequently expanded into other disciplines within creative media, so things of film studies, animation, all the digital arts, game development, game art, graphic arts. And every new vertical of education that SAE has pursued, that core philosophy has continued through. So today, globally, SAE is quite an interesting educational group. It may be one of a kind. We operate almost 30 countries and have over 50 campuses in those countries worldwide. And so it's quite a undertaking that SAE is pursuing to educate and employ creative media artists all over the world.
Very interesting, and I love to hear your previous experience with Newmont. More and more I'm starting to hear this, and it just makes me excited for the future of education here. Where previously, in my opinion, schools and institutions there was a huge lack of communication between schools and institutions and actual employers, and that piece of paper that students would get was exactly that, a piece of paper, and it was up to them to really be able to, show their stuff and get experience to be able to get to those employers. Whereas you took this backwards design approach of actually going to the employer and saying, what do you need, and developing competencies from there. Southern New Hampshire is starting to do that. Obviously, Western Governors does that in the in the nonprofit private space. But I just feel to differentiate yourself in this, an institution to differentiate itself in this sort of marketplace, that is a huge piece of the puzzle, in my opinion. Would you agree?
No, I absolutely agree, Nick. And look, I don't mind for the listeners to kind of walk through at least a couple of key points of difference. Sometimes it's like, well, that sounds great. That's the what. What's the how? Explain the how.
Yes.
And I think we might want to dive into that. One phrase that comes to my mind on the point you were just making, though, Nick, has to do with what I call, at the end of the day, are we trying to provide the students as educators? Who's taking ownership and responsibility or stewardship? And for the students in terms of this thought, do you want to provide a transcript or do you want to provide a resume? Because the closer you can get to a resume type credential for the students as they head toward graduation, obviously the more seamlessly they're going to transition into the professional world. Right?
Yes.
And so how do you do that? How do you provide, inside of an academic environment, how do you provide a resume? So here's some thoughts, at least, these are tried and true methods. I mean, some institutions will provide internships or internship-like experiences. You'll hear the term co-op study. Drexel comes to mind. There are others that tend to have used these successfully. Globally, you'll see hospitality programs, hotel management programs tend to be very, very good at providing their students summer or even year-round internship opportunities. The elite Swiss hospitality schools do a great job of that. And not surprising, the reason they're elite is because the top 4-star, 5-star hotel groups in the world go there to employ their graduates because they're prepared. They're sitting there with a resume. They can talk very specifically about the work experiences they've had and what they've learned from those experiences. I think the other dimension of education that I've tried to play a part in changing is what I call the old agrarian calendar system, this concept historically that we sort of went to school during the dark winter months and we farmed the farm during the summer, long summer days. I mean, that has to be a several hundred-year-old notion. And to us, modern industry doesn't normally work on that calendar, and I'm not convinced that the modern education institution should be running on that calendar. I mean, if you want to prepare graduates for industry, they pretty much need to understand how to work 8 to 5 or 8 to 8. And
right.
So I'm not saying that students at some of the more rigorous traditional universities aren't working very hard. I think they are. But there always seems to be this concept that let's work hard for a couple of semesters and then we'll sort of take a bit of time off during the rest of the year. And then the last thing, I think, in addition to sort of the standard concepts around internship, externships, placement, I think there needs to be, at least we've successfully done this, and that is to build into the curriculum from day one all the way through graduation what's come to be known as project or problem-based learning. And why do I say that? I believe that's because in a project-based learning environment, you can drive those soft skills that I was referring to earlier. And I think that can be done by individual faculty members, can take ownership to do that in their individual courses. But I also think that the chief academic officers, the presidents of colleges and universities, need to take some ownership for trying to move their institutions, as difficult as that may be, but to try to move them closer and closer to a project-based learning structure across the entire institution. And the reason you want to do that is because the learning outcomes from that methodology is just so much better than a more traditional lecture-centric or lecture-driven approach. So those are some of the hows, and there's probably a longer list than that of what we've been able to achieve historically, at least from my personal experience.
Right. And, it's such an interesting topic to me because, I worked at an edtech startup at one point, and I got this experience where I never really had interacted with web developers, web designers before, and all this sort of stuff. And when I would talk about these sort of progressive topics in education, and the change from, the shift from the traditional kind of 4-year, 2 or 4 year degree to this competency-based approach, they said, well, what are you talking about? We do that already. That's how developers are. It's a skills based discipline in such regard that a 4-year computer science degree doesn't matter as much as can you do HTML, can you do CSS, can you do JavaScript, that sort of thing. And it really made me think. I said to myself, there's obviously these disciplines where it's already been happening, and it's a skills based kind of economy for that, a job market for that sort of thing. Do you think it's only certain disciplines that can utilize this competency based approach, or can you do it in more of the softer type disciplines?
No, that's a great question. I've thought a lot about that issue over the years, Nick, because arguably people would say, well, okay, fine, Scott, you have history in being able to do this in software development. You now have history of doing it in the broader creative media space, but is it applicable across other disciplines? I would ask one fundamental question. I think the way to frame that question up, Nick, is to ask the following question. Is it fundamentally a performance-based discipline? Mm-hmm. You have to perform in your work, or is it purely analytic? Is it work that you just purely do in your head?
Yeah.
Can you do it on your own? And you don't need to be dependent on colleagues or coworkers. Now, there aren't many jobs in the 21st century that aren't networked. And so I don't know how many disciplines could completely escape that question. But having said that, let's think through it. What about somebody who's working in top-tier accounting firm these days globally? Do they need to know how to work in teams, to collaborate, to communicate, to engage that way, to run projects, right? Yes, they do. So, could the entire accounting profession globally benefit by an institution, one or more, 100 of them, that would be more project and competency-based in their approach? Could we graduate 4-year bachelors of accounting grads in 2.5 to 3 years instead of the more 4 to 5 year conventional approach? Could you embed a CPA exam so at least they had the credential as well as the experience inside the funnel, inside the educational pipeline, instead of waiting until after they've graduated?
Yes.
And those are all, if I were thinking like Price Waterhouse or KPMG or those major firms, and I know they need thousands and thousands of new entry-level graduates to come in, I would be doing everything in my power if I were running the HR division for those to try to help the educational institutions that are providing accounting talent to be thinking along those lines. So, and I think that analogy applies to other disciplines. Engineers. And engineers are a practice-based discipline. Ideally, as you said earlier, they'd be graduating with a portfolio of work and a real resume before they, built their first bridge, right?
Right.
And I think there are others. I think generally business, which is normally, just basic business studies, marketing, finance, management. I think those are practice-based disciplines. Historically, the creative media, creative arts is where a lot of this started, because at the end of the day, we think of a traditional art portfolio as the summum bonum of the educational experience, right? You're an art student, you carry your beautiful art portfolio around with you at the end of your senior year. But I think it applies much more broadly than we perhaps would previously have thought.
It's a great point. That's a great point, talking about how you should ask yourself the question: is this a performance-based discipline? And most disciplines are going to have some sort of teamwork or soft skill kind of component to them. So there has to be, like you said, there should be probably at least a competency-based approach for that soft skill, maybe not the hard skill itself and the analytical components of it, but really interesting.
I'll give you one other example. I'm sorry, Nick, I interrupted.
No, it's great.
I was gonna highlight one other example. I just came back from a trip to Australia. SAE's parent institution is Navitas, which is based out of Australia. They're doing something for fresh graduates or for recent graduates in the Australian market that I really thought was interesting. So we all know that many, many students finish their bachelor's degrees and then struggle to get sort of inserted into the workforce at the right level, and they just struggle. There isn't sort of a course necessarily at every university in how do I get a job coming up out of my bachelor's degree. So Navitas actually in Australia has started something called the Career Experience Program. And I was really fascinated to see this past week in Sydney. They offer an 18-week work readiness program, which includes some coursework, 36 hours of coursework, and then a 12-week full-time internship placement.
Great.
So the placement is actually arranged by Navitas's organization, right? And it's both an academic experience and a placement experience. But you can imagine the success rate then of being placed as a graduate after having that organized career experience program. I just thought that was fascinating. And I, of course, sitting there as an American educator, I sat and looked at that program and thought, wow, the potential, even of something, and that's fairly basic, but even something as basic as that could have, potentially game-changing implications in a market as large as the United States.
I love that. That's fantastic to hear. So can you take us through, Scott, I guess the student experience for one of your students who may be going through the audio engineering path? What's their learning path? What's the student experience for them?
Well, that's a great point. I guess good question. So SAE, our campuses very much reflect or mirror, Nick, real-world professional recording environments. Right. Over time, we will continue to grow them so that it's not just audio-centric, but we're adding film and animation. Core disciplines will be added over the next few years, which really means that then they'll become professional creative environments, not just creative media environments, not just audio. Mm-hmm. But for an SAE typical student, we offer both the diploma, which is just under a one-year course, and we offer associate degrees today. And the students are grounded in theory, so digital signal flow, all the various theories that help them understand the flow of sound and mixing and recording. They are able to get, as they progress through the program, they're exposed to increasingly sophisticated technical products. Right, basically equipment and technologies that enable them to, as they head toward graduation, to be really prepared to move out into industry. And that represents, frankly, a multi-million-dollar investment on our part at each of our 7 campuses here in the United States. We've just finished 2 beautiful campuses in Chelsea and New York City, Manhattan, as well as in Chicago, but we also have campuses in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then in Nashville, and Atlanta has a beautiful campus, and also in Miami. So those are our 7 campuses here in the U.S. The students are, of course, our instructors and lecturers are all industry-grade professionals as well. And there's just, if you come onto campus at SAE or students come on campus, what you'll see is quite interesting, and it's palpable. When I say see, it's really what you feel or what you'll sense is a very, very deep passion and commitment to the world of creative media. And today, quite focused on the world of audio engineering, but again, we'll continue to shift as we move forward. And it's just, when you have that passion, they say in education that passion can almost overcome any other deficiencies that a teacher may have. And I really believe that. I really think that teachers who bring that passion to the classroom and to the learning experience every single day, it's a force, it's energy, it's power, it's inspiration. It helps kids to do things that they just otherwise wouldn't have necessarily the vision or the motivation or the self-discipline to do. It overcomes an awful lot of deficiencies in that teacher-student experience. So when you're on an SAE campus and you get to visit one at some point, Nick, I would encourage you to do that. You'll just feel it. It runs deep in the DNA of SAE.
That's great. I would absolutely love to. I'll actually be in Los Angeles in a couple of weeks. So we'll have to talk about the potential of that.
Yeah.
So my last question, think about this one. It's usually a fun one, but people sometimes get challenged. But if you could have dinner with one person you admire, past or present, who would it be and why?
That's a really good question. I would want to have dinner with Steve Jobs, and I don't know that that's possible in this life. I just look at what Steve accomplished, fairly abbreviated, unfortunately, life. I look at his commitment to excellence, his commitment to innovation, his willingness to just lay it all on the line in terms of making commitments, and his thinking, the clarity of thought, his ability to bring teams together in exciting and challenging efforts. When Jobs came back into Apple, obviously the corporate bureaucracy was pretty well established, but he created what's called a skunkworks type project and was able to recruit onto that project some outstanding people. And that was his second time in coming back, right? That's when the iPod and all the subsequent products, iPhone, all emerged the second time around. We shouldn't forget the first time around. We basically rolled out into the market one of the most successful consumer launches of all time, which was the Macintosh. And so, as I've read the biography, as I've thought about Apple, I think that educators, at least the ones that really want to innovate in the 21st century, I think we could do worse than emulating Steve Jobs. And I know everybody has their warts. I mean, Steve had his unusual characteristics as well as we all do. But I just think that if you step back and think about it, I'd love to meet the guy and just have a candid conversation. And you know what? I'd love to have Steve Jobs' thoughts on how we would continue to innovate in the world of higher education or even K-12 education. I'm sure he would have had some really, very insightful thinking about it. And I guess if I could have one or two other folks at the dinner table, that would be fine as well. But, I'd love to have had some time with Steve Jobs.
That's a great one. It's a great one. Nice way to end it. So, Scott, is there any way that the audience can support you? Is there what's the best way for us to contact you?
Well, I'm available anytime through SAE. I mean, I'm at s.mckinley at SAE.edu, and I'm happy to engage with the broader audience in the whole discussion about innovation in higher education. It's just, I'm applying that mindset and that skill set to what we do at SAE and Navitas today, and I think we're a great group, and we'll continue to do some really innovative and great things globally with this amazing creative media platform that we have. But if there are other people that want to pursue the common journey, sort of fellow travelers out there, I'm very happy to engage with them in the discussion and the debate and the dialogue. And I certainly don't have all the answers, barely half the questions that we need, but to solve the challenges. But I think there is a community out there of like-minded individuals that really want to change the face of higher education and make a difference. And that's why I do what I've been doing for the last number of years. So I appreciate your time today, Nick, very much. Thanks. Scott,
thanks for joining us today, and keep up the great work. Much appreciated.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you would like show notes or more details about our conversations, please do visit meeteducationproject.com. Please also subscribe to us on iTunes under Meet Education Project. Thanks, and see you all next time.